All right.
Oh, that's bright.
Good morning. It is bright. Good afternoon. It's great to see everybody. In the words of the famous philosopher Monty Python, any Monty Python fans out there? Here we got a few. Now for something completely different. I was listening to the last talk, and I'm pretty sure AI is going to solve everything, or the world's going to come to an end. I'm not sure which. But we're going to talk about kind of the doing good side, if you will. I love the title of this session, Putting Values Back in the Value Chain, a little twist on words there, if you will. But today we have a fantastic panel that's going to get into how we integrate sustainability, or that much maligned abbreviation ESG, into the value chain, into what we do every day in business. So that's going to be the discussion today. Again, we have this great panel. What I'm going to do is going to ask each panelist to introduce themselves just very briefly, where do they work, title, and how they got into this issue. And then I'll introduce myself, give a couple of words, and then we'll get into some Q&A. But I do want to encourage your questions. We'll have time at the end for a really nice dialogue. And I know this is a controversial topic, so let's get into it. Let me just start on my left, and please introduce yourself.
Sure. Thanks, Tim. Good afternoon, everyone. I am Sereen Ahmed. I work in Barclays Bank as America's Head of Trade and Working Capital, based in New York. I'm privileged to be here today among the distinguished panelists to discuss a very critical topic, ESG. So ESG is not a passing trend, as some of you maybe thought. It's here to stay, and it's must-have. It's not nice to have. So I would say ESG is the cornerstone for any responsible corporate business practices. I look forward to discuss in depth about the role of the banks in advancing ESG during this session. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Sereen. And Stephan.
Yeah, thanks. Wonderful to be here. Thank you, Stephan Jacob, one of the founders. Up until 2 weeks ago, I was COO of Cotopaxi for the last 10 years, just moved into a global brand building role, putting the founder hat back on to grow the Cotopaxi brand, which is an outdoor gear brand. We design, manufacture outdoor apparel, backpacks, sleeping bags, the likes, outside of the US. There's a deep social humanitarian mission that's tied to who we are as a brand. And over the last couple of years, I've been able to give about $3.3 million through the Cotopaxi Foundation to various poverty alleviation efforts. Look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Fantastic. Ian.
Thanks, Tim. Ian Laverty. I'm the Chief Revenue Officer at TradeSun. So TradeSun has data and software platforms that support trade digitization and automation. So that's data extraction, document checking, document classification, and compliance. And if you were watching the Future Leader projects earlier on, the first project, it's use case 1, 3, and 4. So that's the document checking and the compliance monitoring. We support banks, helping them to implement that within their organization. In the context of this, in December 2022, TradeSun acquired Coriolis ESG, which was a sustainability assessment platform developed by Coriolis Technologies, working with banks, around 70 banks around the world, as well as organizations like BAFT and the International Chamber of Commerce, to develop a fully automated sustainability assessment platform that has the capability to assess the business entity, so the buyer or the supplier, but also at the transaction level. It was built by you for your use, and again, we help banks and large corporates to implement sustainability in trade finance and supply chain finance.
Thanks, Ian. And my name's Tim Mohin. I'm a partner and director at BCG, Boston Consulting Group. But that's just the end of the story. I've actually only been with BCG a little over a year now, but I've been in sustainability. This is my 4th decade of working on this topic. So I've had many jobs, but only one profession, and I'm lucky enough to say my profession is my passion. I've always worked in sustainability since before we had the word sustainability. So when I started, I went along with that. But I would say that over that period of time, companies started to do this more as a reputational matter. We saw that it attracts employees, so we have recruit, retain, and engage. It helps with investor relations. It helps with customer relations. And so there was all these sort of values, but let's face it, I was kind of in a marketing role. Fast forward to today. Things have changed. In my 40 years in this space, I've never seen a more dynamic time than what we have right now with sustainability. And it's almost like back to the future, because now we're heading into a new regulatory environment. And so this term ESG, while it's become sort of a political football, there's real teeth to some of the policies and standards that we're seeing all over the world. Probably many of you saw the Securities and Exchange Commission issue their long-awaited final rule on March 6th and then pulled it back on April 4th. So that was quick, giving you a sense of like how the issue is so politicized. But that rule took 2 years from proposal to issuance, was to force any listed company to basically disclose its greenhouse gas emissions, but not just its emissions, its risks, opportunities, governance. There's a whole lot in there. And the SEC, whether you're betting it's going to go forward or not, is only one out of many. So we're seeing Europe is just kind of pumping out the regulations and standards right now. And you're also seeing in other capital markets around the world, from Singapore to Hong Kong to Japan to the UK to Australia, companies are going to have to disclose their greenhouse gas emissions in their financials. And in some cases, more than climate change. In some cases, it'll be the full suite of environmental, social, and governance issues that have to go into the financials. Now you say, well, okay, if companies have been doing this for a long time anyway, what's the big deal? I mean, we just put it in our financials. Well, it changes everything. My current client base at BCG, we're working with a lot of banks, we're working with a lot of enterprise customers. When you take a voluntary matter and you pull it into the financials, you have to have the controls, the auditing, the tooling, the timing, the capabilities, the governance. I mean, it changes everything. And so a lot of our clients are going through this transformation right now in preparation for disclosure in their financials. And the last thing I'll say, and then we'll open it up to the panel, is not just disclosure. As somebody who, I left one piece of my resume out, and probably the reason I'm on this panel, I was, for a while, the CEO of a group called the Global Reporting Initiative, GRI, which until recently, until all these changes, was the dominant sustainability disclosure standard, but that's now being taken over by these new regs and standards. And one of the things I used to say in that role, and I'll say to all of you, is data is only useful if it's used. I mean, reporting it's a milestone, not an objective, that companies really need to look at this information. The whole purpose of the information is to understand and identify the risks and opportunities to the enterprise. And I think that's the key message that we all have to keep in mind as this sweeping change and these political winds kind of whip through the entire economy. So that's by way of introduction. We have a very interesting panel to kind of dive deeper into that. And I want to start with Stephan. Stephan, you've founded a company that I think is pretty cool. I love the products. Definitely want to buy some. But tell me a little bit about your journey in terms of how sustainability is wrapped into your company, and what are you doing going forward with sustainability?
Yeah. Well, I think as human beings, I think we have an innate desire to create. And some people do that through art, some people do that through music. International bankers may do it through export factoring or embedded banking. And entrepreneurs, we do it through building product and building teams. So my co-founder and I, we felt strongly around building a brand. We were entrepreneurs before. Building a brand around people and around poverty alleviation at the very core of what we were going to do. And this is rooted in an experience. In 2003, I was working for a nonprofit organization that was dedicated to the elimination of child labor on the Indonesian archipelago. And that was a really wonderful, rewarding and eye-opening experience. Rewarding in the sense that we took several hundred kids from fishing platforms and human trafficking situations back into their communities, into their schools. And we're able to encourage both at the municipal and at the federal level anti-child labor legislation to be passed. And it was also really eye-opening in that it just made me realize how lucky I'd been by the sheer luck of the draw. From Germany originally, being born in a place where I didn't have to worry about nutrition and shelter and economic opportunity. It was simply a given. And these kids and their families were born in a hard place. And so that's at the core of the brand, right, to try to do something about that. We incorporated it as a benefit corporation, Delaware-based benefit corp, and a certified B Corp, against the advice of our counsel, who told us we would never raise money if we do that. But we're able to prove them wrong. You know, we've raised about $48 million in mainly equity and growth capital, most recently from Bain Capital's Triple Impact Fund. We pushed hard to get to profitability because we sort of saw the writing on the wall to some extent with some of our direct-to-consumer peers who were scaling like crazy but had really trouble getting, you know, to profitability and are now being are in trouble in the public markets. And then obviously we had traditional, you know, banking relationships with Silicon Valley in the early years, and now with JP Morgan for, you know, debt capital, working capital, and loan arrangements. But that was sort of the journey for us, right? To say, like, we knew that we wanted to be a mission-driven brand before we even knew what kind of product we would sell. And that has steered us well, and I think has helped us build sort of a differentiated, you know, strategic moat around the brand.
That's a phenomenal story. So Sereen, turning to you and maybe bringing in kind of the banker interests, like, how do banks support organizations like Cotopaxi where DNA is at, the sustainability is in their DNA, it's at the core of the organization? Like, how do you attach that to your industry?
Absolutely. There is no doubt that the banks plays a crucial role in helping the business and the companies to integrate ESG in their core business strategy. But it's not only the banks. Everyone has a role to play here. Everyone, when I say I'm talking about regulators, banks, even the consumer has a role, like, you know, to play through this transition. Now, going back to the banks, we have various ways to help the company through this transition. One of them, it is on the product innovation. So as you mentioned, this is a journey. It needs a lot of investment. It needs a lot of effort. If we're going to look today, most of the big banks, they are creating this societal impact by introducing a lot of new products to help the clients to go through this transition. One of the products that I wanted to talk about it's the sustainability trade-linked facility, where we sit with the client. We understand first, like, we wanted to understand their business. We have a team that they go through all of those, like, you know, process, and they agree with them on what the KPIs that they need to set. And we advise them the KPIs should be, like, you know, not more than 3, because we don't want to overpromise or let them, like, you know, overstretch themselves. And those KPIs, it has to be achievable. It has to be something that they can deliver. And if they deliver on their KPIs, we will gonna give them some discounting on the price, which will gonna be as a reward, which will gonna be agreed beforehand. If they don't, which I don't like to say penalize them, because here we don't, like, you know, it's not a penalize, it's a journey. We all learn as we go with this journey. What we do the periodical review to understand where they are, how they can also progress, why they were not successful in delivering on these KPIs. And then maybe we can review that and we can help them to introduce another one. The other part, which is I find it interesting, the bank roles usually it is on providing finance, but for the ESG, I'm seeing that there is a shift. The banks, they are acting as advisory. We are investing a lot in hiring talent from the market, where they act as advisory through this journey to the clients, especially the SMEs clients, where they don't have a budget to hire consultant, or they have a lot of, like, you know, basic system. So what we do, we sit in one table, We try to do a lot of education. We also finance them to provide them with the right tools to help them through this transition. If I look to the tools that we have today, or most of the companies, even the banks, the system that we have, it's a legacy. It may not help in terms of the data reporting, in terms of the risk management. So this is why we do a lot of education, and I find the education part, it's really impressive, especially in UK, we have a lot of farmers. They don't know how to start, where to start. So we help them to set their goals, to define the goals, and to measure the success. And some of the time also we help them to finance some of the equipment that they wanted to go through this transition. We have a lot of ways, but those are one that I find them as the key factors that help the companies to go through this transition.
Fantastic, thank you, Sereen. So Ian, let's bring you in here. How are fintechs getting involved in this and supporting your clients with all of the data and KPI needs that come along with ESG? And specifically, since the last panel was on this, how does AI weigh into this whole area as well?
I don't think you could have a panel about technology without mentioning AI, could you, at the moment? And I think this is probably the fourth session that it's been in. No, it's an interesting question, Tim, but I think there's a few areas where data and AI in particular can really support sustainability in trade. And I think for fintechs, it's in part acting as the bridge between the corporation, and in particular the corporation supply chain, and the financer, bank or independent. I was listening to Todd's opening presentation this morning and saw with interest one of the Future Leader projects was designing a client questionnaire for ESG. And I think that's a really interesting project, and actually potentially a really valuable one for BAF to embark on. Because I think it's not just the questions within the questionnaire, but it's how you implement the questionnaire as well. And we know from working with banks and with corporations and working with their supply chains, as soon as you introduce lengthy questionnaires into the process, it becomes an enormous administration burden on each of the suppliers, particularly the smaller businesses. That in turn becomes an administration burden on the bank and on the buyer, the corporation, because they've got to obtain all the answers and make sure they get the feedback and all of the questionnaires. And then there's the interpretation of something that's been manually input or manually interpreted, so the question's been interpreted by a human and then written by a human that needs to be analysed by another human. So it becomes quite subjective in the assessment part of that as well. And if you are asking a business to complete a questionnaire, particularly if there's an incentive for a good sustainability outcome or a good sustainability report, there is the tendency for people to, well, we've all marked our own homework and given ourselves the benefit of the doubt, so if you're not sure, you tend to err on the positive, especially if you're worried about consequences of not. So I think where fintechs and where data and AI can help is, rather than going pure questionnaire, how much of that information can we obtain from independent, quality verifiable data sources so that we're pre-populating a lot of that. We can always use the questionnaire to supplement and to ask the business for points of information that we're not able to get from independent data sources. But I think the challenge really is, rather than just pure questionnaire, rephrasing the same challenge and saying, rather than what does the questionnaire look like, it's what is the information that we need? So what's the purpose of the questionnaire? What is the information that we're trying to gather? What's the data that we're trying to gather? How much of that can we get from independent automated data sources to help the supply chain? And then what do we need to ask the business on top of that? I think the other challenge with the questionnaires, and we see this a lot, the information that you will need, it can't be one questionnaire fits all. Which I think is one of the challenges that they're going to address, and I think it's a really good one. Those questionnaires, or rather, again, let me rephrase it, the data that you require, the information that you require, will vary by region, it'll vary by country, it'll almost certainly vary by industry type or product manufacturing process type. So what you would ask us as a data company is very different from what you would ask a steel blast furnace company, for example. So again, that process of automating, but the AI part of it can recognize either where the company is based or what the product or the manufacturing process or the service is, and therefore what is the information that's specific to that organization, and pulling the data in for that. So I think there's a number of areas where data and AI can reduce the manual burden, but also make sure that we've got consistent objective data sets to encourage that sustainable trade.
This is a terrific answer because having been in this space a long time, this whole quote, scope 3, what's going on in your value chain. And SEC notably left that out of the final rule, but they didn't leave out the risk part. So you can kind of skip over some of this laborious data checking if you kind of look at it from a risk point of view. And I think it's phenomenal when you can increase efficiency and effectiveness, which I think tech can do. So that's great. So we're going to do one more round of questions, but I do want to open it up. So use the Slido. You can even ask questions live. That would be revolutionary, but why not? So let's go into this last round, and I'm going to go back to Stephan again. And I'd love to. I had the great pleasure of chatting with you a little bit before the meeting, and so I maybe know some of the answers to this. But I'd love for you to explain how your suppliers engage with Cotopaxi when providing this information about sustainability reporting.
Yeah, and I agree wholeheartedly, Ian. Right, it puts a burden on an organization to commit to that level of accountability, right? And the reporting, I think, supplier side is a big piece of that, right? We feel strongly that genuine commitment to transparency and accountability is the sort of foundation for we're a values-driven brand. We make that promise to our consumers, so we need to be able to back that up with real data. So we rely on strong third-party partners, right? We're subscribed to the Sustainable Apparel Coalition, HIG Index, where every input into our products is cataloged and assessed for environmental impact and potential negative externalities. We have, not all of our suppliers, but a good number of them are fair trade certified with all the sort of reporting requirements that come from that. And then GRI, your previous organization is a framework that we use to sort of, the GRI Contact Index to assess the materiality and salience topics that we report out on and hold, again, ourselves accountable. We have high expectations of our suppliers in terms of our code of conduct, human rights policy, animal welfare policy, restricts a substance list. And in our industry, right, our consumers are demanding it. Our retailers are demanding it, right? REI has very strict rules as to what kind of product they will accept, right? And so we need to be able to show that we comply with all of these rules. And it is a significant burden. In terms of environmental impact, over 95% of our total carbon emissions happen at our Tier 2 and Tier 2 production and manufacturing. And so we, last year, fully offset that. Obviously, we all know offsetting is problematic and has really become a topic of contention. So we're now going the route of true avoidance, working closely with our suppliers to reduce their water consumption, reduce their electricity, replace through renewable sources in order to reduce the overall carbon intensity score, which sort of measures the metric tons emitted per $1 million of revenue, which we keep under 1%. As a way to stay clean there. And then by the second half of this year, 100% of the products will be what we call the 3 Rs. They will either be recycled, made from remnant dead stock material, or responsibly sourced under responsible sourcing standards like the RSD down standard, for example. So yeah, there's no one golden bullet. It's a very multifaceted approach to trying to do the right thing and be able to prove that that's what's happening.
Fantastic. So Sereen, we'll turn back to you from the banking perspective. What have you seen in terms of demand from your corporate clients for sustainability-linked products, and in this case, financial products?
Yeah, indeed. We have seen uptake on the sustainability products, and this is due to several factors. Same what you have mentioned on the regulatory pressure, we are seeing because of the recent SEC rules on the disclosure, there are a lot of demands on the sustainability supply chain finance products. Because the company, they have realized they don't have a choice. Now they need to start disclosing on the ESG of their suppliers. If we look to the data today, why this is very important, 80% of the global trading happen through the supply chain. So when we see the regulators, they are started stepping in and putting the rules, this is a very good sign. This is will start helping the entire supply chain, because we as a bank today, even the clients, some of the clients, if we will gonna look on the supply chain, we may say this is a sustainable supply chain of products, but we don't see the entire supply chain. We are seeing only the first-tier suppliers. There are a lot of suppliers in different jurisdictions that the banks, they don't have even access on it. By having the fintech that they are helping us on these data, on also the regulators step in and put all of those restrictions, that will gonna be putting a pressure on the corporate and even on the banks, on everyone, that they have to do something. This is where we are seeing, because they need to abide with it, and they know it is there. They cannot, like, you know, not do anything about it. So it is the sustainable supply chain facility, or, like, you know, products that I'm seeing a lot of demand. Yeah.
Thank you. And the last formal question we have is for Ian, but might be my favorite one. We'll see. The nexus between sustainability and trade is quite interesting, and I'd love you to comment on this, but just as a warm-up, we're seeing across Europe something called the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. I don't know if you're following this, but some goods that are being imported to Europe, starting with bulk goods like steel and aluminum, et cetera, are going to be taxed at the border for their embedded carbon, how much carbon it took to make that particular product. And then last week we saw John Podesta, who's the president's advisor on climate change, say that they're going to start looking at this issue in the US as well. So we may be heading into a bit of a climate trade war, I don't know. But it is quite an interesting time when it comes to this stuff. So I'd love to hear your views on how sustainability reporting, and specifically the fintech that supports it, opens up these opportunities, and or are we seeing the trade gap widen in this space?
Now, I think it's a really interesting point. And actually, if you look at the questions that are coming in, there's 3 questions that are on the same line already, which is good. So I'm going to try and multitask here and answer 2 questions at the same time. So I'll answer your question, Tim, and then the top question there. How do we think we'll best overcome the burden of getting SME organizations, particularly in emerging markets, to comply with ESG standards set by Western regulators? So I think this is the challenge. So we've seen the trade finance gap, despite lots of interventions and initiatives, widening over the last few years. And if we're not careful, then the application of ESG regulation or sustainability regulation could exacerbate that and make it worse. And I was listening to an expert in the field less than 20 minutes ago, Tim, who made a statement: data is only useful if it's used. I'm going to modify that slightly if I can and say data is only useful if it's used appropriately. And I think that's the challenge. And you know, we're part of the, and we give input into the BAFT ESG working groups. And the direction that that's taking, I think, is actually the answer to this, which is not to look for one standard and not to look for one framework, but to recognize that there are regional variations required in that. So rather than, I think there's another one there about frameworks created by Western governments and Western regulators, and I think that is the same point. If we can get to a place where we are assessing a business based on the sustainability priorities in their region, rather than just the region of the corporate or the buyer, I think that's the right place to be. The challenge with that for financial institutions is if you're looking at a global supply chain, you then have to be an expert in the sustainability regulations in every region in the world that has a separate framework. Now, that sounds difficult. There are a few things that can help there. The first is when you look at these frameworks and standards, I use this term commonality. There's about 90% commonality between them. They're actually all largely the same, and they use the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals as their foundation framework. But then you have regional variations coming into play, and you've got different taxonomies being set up. This is again where I think fintechs can help. By identifying the location of the supplier within the supply chain and recognizing what the framework is asking for, and then mapping either the data, whether it's automated data or whether it's data and information that the supplier has provided themselves through survey and questionnaire. But by taking that data and applying it to a regional framework, it gives the financer the opportunity to have the buyer adherent to the ESG taxonomy or sustainability taxonomy where they're based, but each of the suppliers adhering to and complying with a sustainability taxonomy in the location in which they're based as well. And I think once we get to that place, I think we'll be in a place where actually suppliers all around the world, particularly in developing markets, will buy into it because it's been built for them as well as for everybody else.
Terrific. Before we jump in, and this guy Anonymous is, I don't know who he is, but he's really got a lot of questions.
He's prolific.
You know, the statement that was made by Podesta said, we're importing more carbon than we could ever hope to reduce through the Inflation Reduction Act and the Infrastructure Act, which was just mind-blowing, right? Because we're importing so much material from China and other places that just simply doesn't have the same standard. So obviously an issue that is touching many areas. So let's jump into the questions. They're not necessarily related to any particular speaker, so we're gonna just do a little bit of a free-for-all here in our 7 minutes remaining. But do you think global banks who have a physical presence in emerging markets can play a better role in execution of ESG versus other banks who are away from these markets?
Yes, I think they can, especially the big banks that they have, the global banks that they have a global footprints and the emerging, they can make a societal impact and they can make a difference than the banks that are not operating there. There were one question I want to I was going through it, but now I think it's not on the screen. On if we can get any, or the regulators allow us to get some price benefit. We can't as banks because the regulators, they still not giving any RWA subsidies when it comes to the green products or ESG. We hope that they can introduce new rules because this is a common ask from the clients. Some of the clients, they keep telling us, it's good, you have the products, you can facilitate it, you do the education, but we need some price benefit when it comes to the ESG facility. We try, but we can't because it applies the same RWA of any other assets.
Very good. Well, we have a bunch of questions piling in here, so I know there's an upvoting procedure, but we can actually pick one. Do you want to go down the panel and see, Stephan, if you have a favorite question?
I'll do the one of a majority of suppliers are SMEs in developing markets.
Okay.
Trade finance gap, how can we include them in the sustainability agenda? We have found, if looking cautiously, we have found plenty of suppliers who share our values. A great example, Northern China, Tianjin, where we make our insulated outerwear. The factory owner there, a beautiful human being, made a conscious choice. He was part of an industrial conglomerate in one of the big industrial zones, made a conscious choice to put his facilities not there, which is logistically advantageous, but instead into the countryside to counter sort of the worker dynamic of workers being far away from their family for most of the year and then only seeing their kids, during Chinese New Year. So he put the factory right where they live, right? And so has led to this beautiful dynamic where the worker, the average tenure, at his factory is over 9 years. They are extremely loyal and extremely high quality that comes out of this factory, right? So high alignment, right? They care about, clean water. They care about clean working conditions as much as we do, right? And so I think we have a choice, right, in who we work with, right, and make that a part of that sort of values alignment, make that a part of that choice, and give them a competitive advantage if they operate in a certain way. I think there's financial incentives, obviously, as well. For us, it's about future-proofing their production by saying, hey, we need you as we scale out the requirements that we need to abide by from our consumers, regulatory, and from our customers. Increase. We have higher standards that we need to live up to, so we need you to grow with us, right? And sometimes that means investing into those relationships. But we've always sort of taken that perspective of it's a relationship, it's not just a transaction, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that has sort of changed the dynamic and increased the willingness on both sides to invest in that, to up-level together.
Yeah. And I think even in companies with less enlightened leadership, maybe than your companies, we're starting to see this happen because of pressure from investors, customers, employees, and some of the regs and standards that we mentioned before. So I think this is happening. Ian, there's one up there for you, I think, if you want to.
Which one would that be? So the top one there, how important is the bank and fintech partnership in promoting or enabling sustainability in transaction banking? Well, I'm obviously going to say it's very important, but I think the rationale for that, if you look at services that banks already outsource in this area. You know, credit checking, outsourced to credit reference agencies. Some of the compliance checking, so money laundering, sanctions checking, go to external technology providers and data providers. It's the same here. You know, banks aren't in the game of sustainability reporting, sustainability assessment. That's not a bank's area of expertise, but they do need the output, they need the information. And I think this is where fintechs who specialize in this is where they can be a real service provider to the banks. The question then is, how do the banks use it and how is it implemented to promote sustainability and to promote sustainability with their clients? And I think that's by broadening the understanding, making it objective so that the business can trust why it's being done. The bank can trust the data that's coming to them from the business.
Yeah, and I think for most banks, there, you know, if you recall, there was something called the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, and many banks are signatories to that. In fact, I think the number was over 130 trillion assets under management signed up for this. So there is a great deal of pressure on banks to understand where their money is going and what it's financing.
Exactly.
And that's all based on the data that is being created. So we're getting really close to the end of our time. These are great questions. We're not going to get a chance to answer all of them. But what I'd like to do, just as a way to close out, is just ask the panelists to do kind of a one-sentence wrap-up of the topic and your main message to the audience. And we'll start all the way at the end with Ian, and then we'll come back this way.
Yeah, I think for too long, organizations have been hiding behind the lack of standardization on ESG frameworks. And I think there's more standardization than people realize. So if you're not already doing so, I would get involved in the sustainability journey. There are working groups through BAFT. There's the ICC Principles Sustainable Trade with your colleagues, Tim, with BCG. There are plenty of opportunities to pilot this. So get involved and start working out how it's going to work for you.
Fantastic. Stephan.
Well, I think ESG has become a hot topic, right? And I think it's because there's this perspective that doing good is at odds with doing well economically. And I would love to challenge that. I think our brand equity and our enterprise value is where it is, not in spite of our social doings, but because of, right? It's because of our social and environmental stewardship that we are where we are.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Great ending. Sereen.
It's the same one I started, that the ESG, there is a role of everyone. Everyone has a skin in the game. Regulators has to make more on the ESGs, on the standardization of the ESG framework to make it easier transition for the companies and for everyone.
And I'll just say, given my ancient history in this space, I'll end on an optimistic note. A meeting like this wouldn't have been possible just 5-6 years ago. I think that we are really starting to see the confluence of sustainability and the real economy. And I think that's an up and to the right message. I think that it's going to be a bumpy road. Nothing ever happens on a smooth line like we like it to. All social change is kind of like takes a while and then it takes off. And I think we are starting to see that exponential growth in the concerns about this issue across the economy, including banks and enterprises. So I just want to ask you to join me in thanking all of our wonderful panelists for this discussion today.